During this forum, we discussed many times the crime of aggression, and already Ugo Relva from Amnesty International, thank you very much. Already Ugo Relva from Amnesty International included some words about Professor Klaus Kress. I just wish to add here that Professor Klaus Kress has been the main drafter of the text that we have in the Rome Statute on the crime of aggression, of course together with a number of other states, a number of diplomats, a number of leaders like Ambassador Christian Benaveser, Prince Zayed of Jordan, and many others who led the negotiation for many years on the crime of aggression. So today he is directing at the University of Cologne an International Center for Peace and Security. He's a full professor of law, and Lufthansa stole his luggage, so that's why you might have seen him not in formal clothing during our proceedings. So without further ado, allow me to give the floor to Professor Kress. Of course, we are specifically mentioning what happened on the 24th of February 2022, because we had not seen until World War II a war through which a state would try to annex another state. So that is something that is rather unprecedented, at least in the shape and form that we have been witnessing so far, and I think we need to take stock of this development. Professor Kress.
Honorable members of Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to allow a scholar of international law to address you. Thank you, David, for all you did in bringing this important event together, and to the many compliments that have been made in the direction of David. I would like to add, he is also a very notable and highly respected scholarly voice. I also wish to thank the President of the International Criminal Court for, as I'm still waiting for my luggage to arrive, to help me to a shirt, to allow me to address you properly, yes. There is effective cooperation in international criminal justice. Let me begin by a citation. The ultimate step in avoiding periodic wars, which are inevitable in a system of international lawlessness, is to make statesmen responsible to law. And let me make clear that while this is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment. This is from Robert Jackson's opening speech at the historic Nuremberg trial, the hour of birth of modern international criminal justice. The US chief prosecutor's famous Nuremberg promise resonates more acutely than ever in the face of Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. In view of this, I wish to specifically turn your attention to the crime of aggression. That is, the crime to wage a war of aggression. How to deal with this crime constitutes the single most important challenge in providing international criminal justice in the situation of Ukraine. There can be no doubt President Putin and those other Russian leaders in a position to effectively exercise control over and to direct politically or militarily Russia's war of aggression are under suspicion to have committed the crime of aggression. Yet, the hands of the prosecutor of the ICC are currently tied. Due to limitations contained in the ICC statute that specifically apply to the crime of aggression, the court cannot at present exercise its jurisdiction over this crime in the situation of Ukraine. This has revealed for every citizen of the world to see a glaring gap in the current international legal architecture. It is painful to acknowledge this gap, and this is so for at least 3 reasons. First, in the situation of Ukraine, the war of aggression constitutes, so to speak, the original sin, which has opened the floodgates to all other atrocities. Second, the killing of Ukrainian soldiers in the course of the hostilities during Russia's war of aggression is lawful under the law of international armed conflict. Such killings can therefore not be punished as a war crime and also not as a crime against humanity or genocide. Hence, the crime of aggression is the only crime under international law which covers the responsibility of the leadership of the aggressor state for the senseless losses of human life among soldiers, especially among those of the victim state. Third, as a result of Russia's war of aggression, the prohibition of the use of force is at the risk of erosion. The prohibition of the use of force, which serves the benign purpose to protect weaker states and their populations, and which the International Court of Justice has called a cornerstone of the UN Charter. The waging of a war of aggression was made a crime under international law precisely for the purpose of providing this cornerstone of the international legal order with resilience against the risk of erosion. 3 appeals follow from this conviction, and who, if not you, honorable members of parliament, could bring those appeals powerfully before the governments of the world? Here's the first appeal. International decision makers must urgently change their mindset in one important respect. If they condemn atrocities and demand accountability for atrocities, they should no longer leave out the crime of aggression. For how could one explain to a Ukrainian father or mother of a Ukrainian soldier killed in the course of Russia's war of aggression, or to a Ukrainian father or mother of a Ukrainian civilian killed as a collateral consequence of a military attack by a Russian soldier, that the crime of aggression does not count as an atrocity? In the prevailing international discourse, the crime of aggression, for a variety of reasons, has been sidelined for too long. This could only have encouraged the Russian leadership in their aggressive course of action against Ukraine. There is now one important piece of good news to report to you. Just a few days ago, on 2 November, the UN General Assembly adopted by consensus a resolution in which the activation of the ICC's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression is mentioned for the first time, and in it, which the power of the Security Council to trigger proceedings before the ICC for all 4 crimes under the court's jurisdiction. This is a very welcome first step in the direction of the necessary change of mindset, and it can only be hoped that the future practice and discourse will build on this first step with consistency. The second appeal is as follows. State parties to the ICC statute should now initiate a diplomatic process in view of changing the statute so that the constraints that currently tie the hands of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court with respect to the crime of aggression will be overcome. Sadly, those constraints have been included on the demand, in particular, of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The large majority of states parties to the ICC statute, including in particular African and South American states, had opposed to such constraints. Those states were right. The constraints in question are unprincipled, and they are contrary to Robert Jackson's Nuremberg promise. As the situation of Ukraine makes it plain, those constraints adversely affect the legitimacy of the international criminal justice system in a case of aggression, because they require the ICC, in a situation of an alleged crime of aggression, to apply the crimes under its jurisdiction selectively. At this point, I wish to applaud Parliamentarians for Global Action for having drafted a first proposal for the necessary amendment of the ICC statute. By formulating this important proposal, PGA have once more proven to be a principled and a courageous supporter of the global international criminal justice system and of the International Criminal Court. Finally, the third appeal. The necessary amendment of the ICC statute will take time. In the meantime, states should consider favorably closing the jurisdictional gap regarding the crime of aggression for the situation in Ukraine through the establishment of a special international criminal tribunal. This proposal has already received the support of numerous parliamentary assemblies. It would be wrong to see such a tribunal as a competitor to the ICC. Quite to the contrary, such a tribunal should be seen as a functional extension of the ICC, serving the global international criminal justice system in a manner which is complementary to the ICC's work. Quite similar to the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, such a special tribunal would also help prepare the ground for moving international criminal justice forward by paving the ground for the ICC to assume in the future its proper role in adjudicating, but preferably in preventing the crime of aggression. My distinguished colleague, Professor Jennifer Trahan, will have more to say on the idea of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, so I can leave it here. Just one more thing to conclude. Yesterday, we heard our 2 most honorable speakers from Ukraine making their impressive call for a special tribunal. While it is completely understandable that Ukraine and Ukrainians make such a call to the world, the establishment of a special tribunal should not be seen as serving primarily a legitimate interest of Ukraine and the Ukrainians, or of Europe and the Europeans. Instead, such establishment would serve the international community as a whole, for it would provide the prohibition of the use of force with resilience and in hereby help preventing future wars of aggression. Each and every member state of the United Nations should therefore be prepared to make at least a symbolic investment in this world order interest and support a resolution of the UN General Assembly recommending the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression in the situation of Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for your very clear presentation. And we will open up the debate, of course, because I'm sure there will be questions on this. Online, we have an old friend of Parliamentarians for Global Action, Professor Jennifer Trahan from New York University Center for Global Affairs, who also is the leader of the American branch of the International Association ICC Working Group, and she also convenes the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression, in which also Klaus serves as one of the members of the counselors. And of course, I have omitted to tell you something that was most important for the introduction to Klaus, but the incident that Millie had really disoriented me. But now I see that she's doing very fine, so I can say it. Klaus is the special advisor of the ICC prosecutor on the crime of aggression. So although this is a pro bono position, his appointment was really saluted by the global community as really a major development in the framework of the ICC practice. Jennifer, are you online?
I'm online, David.
Wonderful. Go ahead, please.
Okay. It is a great pleasure to present to you. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. And thank you to Parliamentarians for Global Action for having invited me. We have all been shocked by the severity and barbarity of Russia's invasion, one that has occurred with little pretext of even trying to conform to international law. However, by now you know the International Criminal Court cannot prosecute the crime in this situation because of limitations in its jurisdiction. It is only investigating and prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and if warranted, the crime of genocide. Thus, the crime that started the whole invasion, deemed in the words of the Nuremberg judgment, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains in itself the accumulated evil of the whole. The leaders most responsible for this crime cannot be prosecuted. Why is it the supreme crime? It is the sense that if we did not have the original aggression, the original sin, we would not have reached any of the war crimes or crimes against humanity. But it is broader than that. It encompasses the totality of the victim's suffering. It even encompasses the killing of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, none of whom should have to die and fighting for an illegal war. I'm going to start with some historical background to explain where this crime comes from. If you haven't read it, I commend to you the book, The Internationalists by Ona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, and they provide this background starting in the 1500s. I'll start in 1917. They trace the thinking occurring in the United States that there needs to be an outlawing of war. And the other ideas they are working on at that time is how do you enforce outlawing war? And over 100 years later, we really haven't figured this out. A similar motivation in trying to advance peace stands behind the opening of the Peace Palace in The Hague in 1913. It is the hope that states will arbitrate and later litigate their disputes and not use recourse to force. The US and France took another important step when in 1928 they concluded, with other states joining, the Kellogg-Briand Pact to renounce aggressive force. Of course, that did not prevent the cataclysmic catastrophe of World War II. In the negotiations in the London Charter that created the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the historic decision, of course, was made to pursue individual accountability, including for crimes against the peace, what we now term the crime of aggression. In fact, counts 1 and 2 of the indictment were devoted to that crime, and little known fact that the Nuremberg prosecutions most centrally focused on aggressive war, not the Holocaust. States tried to reinforce the same prohibition against aggressive force in 1945 with Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. This is our core central norm in the Charter system against aggressive force. And at the level of state responsibility, you will know that the Security Council is sometimes able to use its Chapter 7 powers. But when you have a permanent member involved in the aggression, the Council may be deadlocked and paralyzed from taking any effective action by its use of the veto. In 1974, the General Assembly importantly defined aggression in Resolution 3314. And most in the room will know that when the Rome Statute was concluded in 1998, the decision was made already to have 4 crimes in the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, including the crime of aggression. But to finalize the definition, using the General Assembly's definition as a springboard, the crime went into a separate negotiating process before the Special Working Group on the Crime of Aggression and was concluded in the review conference in Kampala, Uganda, with the crime being adopted by all states there by consensus. But unfortunately, the jurisdictional regime is much more limited at the ICC than the jurisdiction for the other crimes. And this is the heart of our problem here. How did we get there? The US and other states led the truncation of jurisdiction in 2010 in Kampala, and France and the UK limited it further in 2017. And here is a massive irony. We have 3 of the 4 Nuremberg allies limiting the jurisdiction out of their own concerns. Thus, when Russia, the successor entity to most of the Soviet Union, which had been the 4th Nuremberg ally, has committed the crime of aggression, the ICC lacks the jurisdiction it needs and should have. For any who don't know, the crime only covers a manifest charter violation. That is a super clear charter violation. We sometimes have gray areas in terms of use of force law. This is not a gray area case. This is a very clear case. And if the crime is not used in this instance, one really might wonder what the international community is waiting for. Is this a crime we really want to put as a relic sitting on a shelf not to be used? In the long run, we need an amendment to the Kampala Amendment's jurisdictional regime. The International Criminal Court quite simply needs more jurisdiction, and I commend parliamentarians for global action and members of parliament who have already supported this and said we need an amendment to the Rome Statute in this regard. And this is also important because one sometimes hears concerns of selectivity. Well, if we don't want selectivity, the way to cure it is a broader amendment. Right now, however, what we need is a gap filler. We don't have jurisdiction in the current situation. And to put it starkly, there is nothing less than the global order that is at risk. Every state has an interest, whatever region of the globe, in protecting the sanctity of the borders of its country and standing behind Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And we will never know if it was too tepid a response to the attempted illegal annexation of Crimea that has gotten us to where we are. And we don't want now too tepid a response fueling China's aspirations on Taiwan or in the South China Sea. To create such a tribunal, the most legitimate way would be going through the UN. We know how this can be done. Ukraine would request this. We know Ukraine already supports these endeavors. The UN General Assembly would need to recommend the negotiations. The tribunal would actually be created by bilateral agreement between the UN and Ukraine. So this is an amalgamation of the process creating the Cambodia Tribunal and Sierra Leone Special Court. So this is a tried and tested process. Sierra Leone Special Court was created on the recommendation of the Security Council, but not under its Chapter 7 powers. So it was just a recommendation that set off the bilateral negotiations between Sierra Leone and the UN. For the Cambodia Tribunal, the recommendation came from the General Assembly. So we know the recommendations can come from the General Assembly. For Cambodia, it ultimately emerged as a tribunal created under Cambodian law, but that was not clear in the initial process. Anyway, so we have the process. I've mentioned why an international tribunal. It would be the strongest international expression of support. There are problems with a hybrid tribunal within the Ukraine system under Ukraine's constitution. And we need an international tribunal if you want to head off immunities problems. So under the definition in 8 bis of the Rome Statute, aggression is a leadership crime. It only covers certain political and military leaders. So if you have immunities for those leaders, then you really cannot prosecute the crime. And this would be an impediment before Ukrainian courts, before courts in other countries on universal jurisdiction or other theories, and potentially also before a regional tribunal. So the way you avoid the immunities problems is you establish an international tribunal through the General Assembly. We have a lot of case law on this. I refer you to the Eurodia decision, the decision that Charles Taylor could be indicted while a sitting head of state of Liberia. Milosevic was also indicted while a sitting head of state. And we have the ruling against President Bashir before the International Criminal Court related to Jordan's arrest obligations, again saying there are no immunities before an international tribunal. I know I don't have unlimited time, so I will just go through some of the key features of such a tribunal. I had the great privilege of presenting on some of the key features in June at the Yale Club in New York City with Ona Hathaway, Astrid Reisinger-Corazzini, David Schaffer, and Klaus Kress, and David Donat-Catin, Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action, was also present. So the proposal, and ultimately these details are for the UN and Ukraine to negotiate. We set forth a template just to show this can be done. And Hans Corell, David Crane, and Erwin Kotler have set forth a similar template. And so working independently, we came up with nearly the same proposals. But our proposal is a fully international tribunal, nothing like the size of the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals, but a small court like the size of the Sierra Leone Special Court, because it is only dealing with one crime in one country. The judges, we believe, should be international ones for reasons of impartiality and the appearance of impartiality. This, we believe, would be best in this situation. The tribunal would only prosecute this crime and only the leaders. The temporal jurisdiction should start in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. This is when the aggression commenced. Some would go earlier to the invasion of Georgia. We always know there are complex budget negotiations at the UN with the establishment of any tribunal. Another option would be establishment in 2022. This year, that would have a more limited focus, but it has a downside. Not only would it not encompass the totality of the harm, it might give the inadvertent impression the crime of aggression needs a full-scale invasion before you can prosecute it. And that would be wrong. Under the definition, it is use of force. It is an act of aggression. That is the trigger. And I think starting in 2014 might reinforce that. Of course, there would be no temporal ending date because the crime is still ongoing. The crime of aggression is committed in two states, the aggressor state and the victim state. So Ukraine having jurisdiction as the victim state would create jurisdiction for these prosecutions. The definition in Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute, we have a solid definition negotiated before the Special Working Group on the crime of aggression with the Russian delegation present and attending and agreeing on the definition. This definition was then adopted by consensus by all state parties to the ICC's Rome Statute. Of course, there would need to be full fair trial protections. I've already discussed immunities. The statute would simply say that head of state government official immunities would not bar prosecution. The tribunal should be located in The Hague. This tribunal is intended to complement the very important work of the International Criminal Court. It would in no way compete with it. It would be a small institution focused on one side. It would be crucial to develop good relations with the International Criminal Court so these institutions can work together. These are just some of the key features. By now, the international community has set up quite a number of these international and hybrid tribunals. We have a very good sense of best practices, and we can mix and match and build the best tribunal possible. The question is really whether states have the will to do so. all of those 100 plus states that stood up for Ukraine in the General Assembly and condemned the Russian invasion and later condemned the attempted annexation must now be put to the test, not to only make hollow promises, but actually to enforce international law. We are facing a moment of deep crisis to the international legal order, and the international community must strongly respond. Honorable members of Parliament, we need your assistance in helping to create this tribunal, also in pressing for the amendment of the Rome Statute and pressing for ratification of the crime of aggression within your country's domestic systems. Only 44 states have yet ratified. Congratulations to Peru, the latest ratifier, but all Rome Statute states parties need to express support for all 4 crimes under the Rome Statute and make this important statement and ratify the crime of aggression amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We have also a video presentation by a very important authority, the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi. But what I would, since his intervention is very broad on nuclear security and the risks that are being perceived internationally and the mandate of his organization, I would open now the floor on the issue of the crime of aggression and take any question or comments. We still have about 10 minutes. And then we move towards the final document after that we have seen the video of the Director General of the Atomic Energy Agency. There is an intervention from Peru. There is an intervention from the UK. Any other interventions? And I really urge you to keep it very, very short, to the point, no protocol required at this stage. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. La invasión de Rusia a Ucrania y las tensiones en el estrecho de Taiwán hacen inevitable pensar en el nacimiento de una nueva orden mundial, cuyo centro será Euroasia, en menoscabo de Occidente. La pregunta es, y en este nuevo escenario geopolítico, ¿cuál será el futuro de la Corte Penal Internacional, teniendo en cuenta que China y Rusia no reconocen la jurisdicción de la Corte Penal Internacional? ¿La Corte se convertirá en un tribunal solo para Occidente? ¿No creen ustedes que la Corte Penal Internacional pierde legitimidad cuando solo investigan a Rusia por crímenes de guerra en Ucrania y no hacen lo mismo con la OTAN? Porque para nadie es un secreto que la Organización del Tratado del Atlántico Norte no solo provee con armas, inteligencia, sino también con personal militar que manejan los drones y el sistema avanzado de artillería con el que se bombardea a la población civil en el Donbass o en el territorio abatido por prorrusos. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I would ask maybe Professor Kress to explain the international legal framework of the right to self-defense, which maybe could be something that would help us to respond to the question without entering into certain issues. Lord Purvis.
Thank you, David. I'm fully aware that the UK hasn't ratified, and many of us in the UK Parliament have called for the UK to ratify on the amendments, and also that there have been many calls for support to the Tribunal for Russian aggression. My question, though, to Professor Dr. Kress is, the amendment reflects, in effect, traditional force from armed and traditional mechanisms. I mentioned earlier, we heard other references about hybrid, economic warfare, aggression, and use of other technologies. including cyber, which in effect may want to bring about the same, but then are they covered, in your understanding, by the amendment? Is it a weak element of the amendment that we need to look at again, or this is for my education, my ignorance, I don't know, so I'm really looking for your help to allow me to understand.
Thank you very much. Professor Kress?
Thank you very much, Madam, for the first question. On those states, and you have mentioned some, who are not state parties to the ICC statutes, and we have touched upon that point, I think, repeatedly during those deliberations. This is, and this will remain, a huge challenge. It demonstrates that the aspiration of universality of this institution has not yet achieved. That's true for China and Russia, but also for especially other important states in the world. That should not a minute, I think, deter those who stand behind the ICC to remain committed and to patiently and with endurance work towards universality, to convince those who have not yet joined by as good, as solid performance as possible to move forward in that direction. And when you speak about the point of selectivity, I could not agree more with you that selectivity is inevitably a core challenge to the legitimacy of this institution. Now, there are 2 points to consider. There are currently jurisdictional limits which essentially have to do with the fact that a number of states are not yet state parties and that the Security Council often acts according to political motivations and not by legal motivation or principles. This will inevitably, as long as this situation exists, result in a certain selectivity. The International Criminal Court, its organs, are not to blame because they have to strictly abide with the law, but one has to try to patiently overcome them. Second, to the extent that the ICC currently has jurisdiction, and this includes jurisdiction over non-state nationals under certain conditions, if the alleged conduct takes place on the territory of a state party, then it is my firm belief, and I'm convinced that the organs of the ICC follow that course of action, that the law has to be applied non-selectively, and it has to be applied, you have mentioned Western states, to them as well, with the same rigor, with the same determination. And just take the situation of Afghanistan that we have mentioned. You know that within this situation there are allegations not only directed to the Taliban, not only directed to Afghan forces, but also to certain organs of the United States of America. This is also part of the jurisdiction, and the law has to be applied non-selectively. That's my view. On your question, sir, thank you very much, and thank you, first of all, very much for your encouraging observation that there is from inside British parliaments an effort to encourage the government to, and how important would it be if there would be some movement from the side of the UK government. So that's encouraging indeed. Now, your question on the definition. I have to simplify for reasons of time, but just 2 core messages. First of all, yes, the definition is narrow. And I believe the definition is narrow for very good reasons, because here, as in many other cases, it was important to base this definition on a robust consensus within the international community and not to enter into more controversial areas. So when you speak about purely, but I underline, purely economical measures of coercion. This would, in my view, not fall under the definition. It would be covered by other principles, but not by the crime of aggression. This is about military force. And if the international community would wish to go further, they would have to change the definition, but that would be a change of existing customary international law as well. It would be a real legal change. And the change of the substantive law should come first before criminal law is changed. On modern technologies, there is, however, often a misunderstanding that this definition, as it is currently in place, Article 8 bis of the ICC statute, does not cover modern technologies such as the use of cyber means, cyber technology. This is not true. If I say it is a narrow definition requiring force, there is an established also jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice that it is not so much the military nature of the means, so traditional weapons to be used, but it is the effect of the means used that counts for the purposes of the definition. So the use of cyber weapons can very well enter into the scope of the definition, provided that this use results in effects that are substantially identical to those that would result from the use of more conventional means. So that would be a fairly short, and I apologize for not being comprehensive, a fairly short answer to your very important question, sir.
Yes, I don't know if Jennifer wants to add. I see.
Sure.
Yes.
I could add very briefly.
Yes.
Just to clarify, the International Criminal Court would not only investigate Russian nationals for crimes in Ukraine, it would investigate the nationals of any country implicated in war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. So if Ukrainian soldiers end up committing war crimes, that would be within the jurisdiction of the court. And if the US were to somehow enable their war crimes, which I'm fervently hoping they are not, and this is not occurring technically, there would be jurisdiction over that as well. David mentioned, of course, simply fighting in the war. This is self-defense that we're seeing Ukraine exercise. In terms of selectivity, the field is not yet perfect. We don't have global jurisdiction, a universality. And that is true of the tribunals as well. We had a Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunal. We should have had a whole tribunal for the crimes in Eastern Congo or Afghanistan. The Security Council has referred situations in Liberia and Darfur, but not other equally meritorious situations. But I think we are far better off that we had the Yugoslav tribunal, Rwanda tribunal, Libya and Darfur referrals than not. So it's a work in progress, and the jurisdiction that the court has is very, very important, and we must all strive to strengthen it. Completely concurring with Klaus, economic encirclement, that was already rejected actually at the Tokyo Tribunal. Japanese claims that its war was self-defense because of economic encirclement. I think we could go back to the Tokyo Tribunal on that. Agreeing with Klaus, that is not picked up under the crime of aggression, but the use of cyber it is simply a new technology, and unfortunately we have the capability to have war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, or crime of aggression either committed through cyber means or facilitated through cyber by, for instance, a blended attack. So yes, cyber attacks into Ukraine are most definitely within the scope of the crime of aggression, potentially the scope of the other crimes as well, war crimes, including potentially earlier cyber attacks into Ukraine, cutting off the electric grid, and there have been a huge number of cyber attacks this year into Ukraine. I think it looks like Russia intended a huge cyber attack to go in complement to the conventional attack. And fortunately, so far, most of the cyber attack has not fully manifested.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have a final question from Miriam of Afghanistan. Please go ahead.
Thank you for... Thank you for giving me a moment to speak. First and foremost, my question to you is, well, a statement beforehand, is in the history of the world, there's never been an insurgency that can attack a country for 20 plus years without the help of a state sponsor in a neighboring country. For every American soldier that was killed in Afghanistan, 1,000 Afghans, more than 1,000 Afghans were killed in the last 20 years. Just the other day, 60 little girls were killed because of Islamic extremism in a school. They just were taking tests. Every day in Pakhtunkhwa, there's Baluch and Pashtun mothers and daughters screaming about their missing family members, and no one's talking about this. The veil has been lifted for a while now. We know exactly where these insurgencies start from. We know exactly where Islamic extremism comes from. Why are these people not held accountable? Why am I not allowed to say their name sometimes? Why are people telling me you're not allowed to say the name of that country sometimes? Why do I have to live in fear? Why do my brothers and sisters get killed because of the color of my skin? Because of I'm poor? Because I'm dirty? Why? Why does my voice not matter? In Afghanistan, I've seen restaurants be attacked. No one talks about the Afghans killed there, but then an article will be written about the dog that was killed there, because my life doesn't matter. And the reason I'm here today is because the beautiful people that I met in this room, and I still have faith. I have faith in these members of parliament. I have faith in the law. I have faith in my own proud people of Afghanistan. I lost my flag. I lost my identity. And I'm still holding on to it. And millions of other Afghans are holding on to our identity, our language, our culture, our history. The importance of this is that it affects every single person in this room. The Taliban are rewriting history. In the recent speeches, the Taliban are saying that the reason that the NATO forces and the US attacked Afghanistan was to eradicate Islam from the face of Afghanistan. This is a complete lie. They're rewriting history. So in 10 years, after millions of students are being taught this history, what are they going to think about your hometowns? It's not going to be stuck in Afghanistan. They're right now making media ads promoting their suicide bombers and their military. I thought they won the war. I thought they brought peace. Who are they creating a military for? Is it just for Afghanistan, or is it for a larger extremist caliphate that they're planning? I urge you and I beg you to not recognize the Taliban as a government. Would the Nazis be allowed to rebrand themselves as a 2.0? Would the KKK be allowed to rebrand themselves as a 2.0 and be gifted a country of 40 million people? I don't believe that would ever happen. Please stand with the Afghan people because it affects your home, economically, safety-wise, security-wise. And I'm sure that this time Afghanistan will be won again, and this time on the backs of the women of Afghanistan. So as your sister and in the land of Evita, I thank you for hosting us, and I pray in her memory to stand with the women of Afghanistan. Thank you again.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Miriam. And today we also heard the head of the government in exile of Myanmar, by the way. The audio was not working so well, but we are not forgetting those who are obliged to be abroad, whereby they were elected democratically by their people. And here, more than the crime of aggression, and Klaus will correct me if I'm wrong, is really the crime against humanity of extermination, torture, enslavement, because what you described yesterday, what's happening with the madrasa, it's the enslavement and brainwashing of children who are used as private property by these Taliban men who are indoctrinating them to become authors of crimes against humanity, and a number of other features which are under an active investigation before the ICC. And if I can also add one comment here, in other situations of wars of aggression, let's remember when Kuwait was absorbed by Iraq in 1990. The entire international community, including the Security Council at the time, united and used their military force to liberate Kuwait from the occupation of and the annexation, the attempted annexation by Iraq. So the question that we need to pose today, in my view, honorable member, is not whereby we go towards this or that geostrategic situation, but why we didn't liberate Ukraine yet. And the response is that because the aggressor state is a state with nuclear weapons and with a permanent vote in the Security Council and a number of other features that are posing a threat to the survival of humankind. That's why we had invited Dr. Rafael Grossi, who is the Director General of the International Organization on Atomic Energy in Vienna. Needless to say, he cannot be with us, although he's Argentinian and a very good friend of many people in this room who invited him, members, of course, of parliament in Argentina and of the Cancelleria here. But he sent us a 5-minute video that we are going to broadcast now. And of course, we understand perfectly he has to have access to the Russian-occupied territories. He has to have access to Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, so his speech will be very legal and neutral, but I think it's worthwhile for us to listen to it. Please.
Distinguished members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the National Congress of Argentina, the country I come from, for inviting me to speak to the 43rd Annual Forum of Parliamentarians for Global Action. Your theme of international justice is an important part of peace building. So too are economic development and nuclear non-proliferation. That's where I will focus my remarks today. I know the IEA and members of Parliament can do a lot of good work when they work together in these areas. The organization I lead may be best known as the world's nuclear watchdog, but it's much more than that. We are also focused on widening access to the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. Uniquely among the UN family, we have world-class laboratories that support our work. They allow us to assist member states in using nuclear science to address enormous challenges, whether it's the scarcity of water or food or the burden of diseases like COVID and cancer. The peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology are so varied that they help countries progress towards 13 of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. For example, nuclear power produces a quarter of the world's low-carbon energy. By 2050, capacity will need to more than double if global climate goals are to be met. The good news is that the public acceptance of nuclear energy is growing, and about 30 new countries are considering or planning to develop a nuclear power program. The IEA helps them put safety, security, and safeguards first by implementing legal frameworks and building institutions to support these plans. But nuclear material is not only used for energy production, it is also used in health and in industry. It can be found in hospitals, research facilities, and at universities. That means countries without nuclear power plants need to be part also of nuclear frameworks too. It's critical that every country implement them so that all types of nuclear material stay safe and out of the wrong hands. From the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Additional Protocol and Revised Small Quantities Protocol, the Convention of Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and its amendments, we all benefit from these frameworks. Without these frameworks, the IAEA safeguards inspectors couldn't do the job of preventing nuclear proliferation and building trust among nations. We couldn't respond and communicate in the case of nuclear emergencies, for example, as we are doing now in Ukraine. These crucial norms took decades to build. Unfortunately, they also take far less time to erode. As the world faces the converging challenges of energy and food insecurity, war, and climate change, it needs nuclear science and technology more than ever. It also needs its global safety net of legal norms to be strong and wide. So let me close by asking you to work with the IAEA to implement and hone the frameworks and norms in nuclear safety, in nuclear security, and safeguards, the inspections that are indispensable. And as members of Parliament, you have a crucial role to play. You set the direction of your country's policies. You design and approve laws. Your national decisions have far-reaching global influence. The IAEA, I can promise, will be there to assist you, not only in understanding what it takes to implement these frameworks, but also in continuing to spread atoms for peace, atoms for development.
I therefore close this panel and I thank Professor Kress, Professor Trahan, and Director General Grossi. Thank you.